Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of these series of podcast pilots, as I'm going to call them. I am here with my friend Frankie Newton. You can say hello.
Hello.
Okay. And today, we are going to be talking about Marvel movies. And this isn't just to capitalize all on the trending factor, because we've actually been, like, talking about doing this for a while now. It just so happens that it's relevant to some degree now. So, I think we'll start off by discussing our history with the franchise. So, do you want to go first?
Sure. What was I believe I watched Iron Man in theaters, and it wasn't like it was a very X-Men era back then,
Yeah.
and I had for some reason I wasn't really a comic book kind of guy at the time, so I hadn't really seen a lot of media on Iron Man,
No one,
but
re-
I watched the film.
no one really knew much about Iron Man.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Well, the general public, anyway. I'm pretty sure there was like of course, comic book fans and also like people who like grew up watching the older cartoons.
And it was probably only like I didn't find myself very hooked to the character at the time, but I didn't stop watching the movies after that, except for the Incredible Hulk, which I never really got around to watching.
Yeah, I too never watched that movie until like 2 years ago, but mostly because I didn't even know it existed. Because like while there was marketing, I thought it was something else entirely. Well, no one, especially children, didn't know anything about the planned universe crossover thing that it eventually became. So, yeah.
Okay.
And is that pretty much what else is your history with the property like?
The Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's not a lot, I mean, I just feel like I've always been there.
Uh,
And there was never really a time where I like wasn't watching the films. And I don't really remember exactly when I like acknowledged it as a franchise and as like an object of filmmaking. I just remember there was a time that I was watching it for movies, and then eventually I was watching it as an entity. Like it became a franchise for me somewhere down the line. I'm not sure. It was probably the first Avengers is when
yeah,
it really
that's when
dawned on me.
most people sort of got the idea, because it was essentially like when everything clicked. As for me, my history is a bit weirder. It's sort of like an inverse of what happened with me and Elijah. We were because like he had more to say, but I didn't. But you kind of don't, and I do, but it's still nonetheless weird. So like most people, I saw Iron Man in the theaters. I was 8 at the time, and like
Mhm.
so since I was like 8, I didn't grasp the idea. No one really did, but I didn't even know about the end credit scene about with the Nick Fury tease. So basically up until like 2017, 2018, maybe I didn't feel the need to become invested in this. And so before that happened, my experience with the MCU was like this. I stuck with the Iron Man films. I saw the first Avengers movie, and then I saw Civil War, and then Doctor Strange is what motivated me to watch everything that came before it.
Mhm.
And I don't know what kept me from watching all the other movies. I guess before I knew about it being an entire franchise of films, there was nothing really motivating me to see the other, because I just thought a bunch of superhero movies were conveniently coming out around the same time from one another. So, and I didn't really. I got most of my. I only really knew about certain comic book characters because I had watched a cartoon that was based off the Avengers film, and
Yeah.
I watched. Weirdly enough, that cartoon is how I was introduced to the Guardians of the Galaxy, and they had more in common with a version of the comics than they did with the version we would later see in the film. So, I think at one point, I had this idea that like the franchise wasn't worth it in general because I guess I was in certain, for lack of a better room, film circles where people were like talking about how like pointless it being an interconnected franchise was. And then I remember like when I first saw um I first saw Civil War when it came out, and then like I remember not really hating it. I didn't really hate it, but I didn't really get as much emotional investment as everyone else did because I hadn't seen anything much of anything else leading up to that point. So I was just like, yeah, it's okay. But then when I went and rewatched everything else, I was like, this is so much better. I honestly kind of went to go see it because Spider Man was in it, so I was gonna see it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I skipped out on most of the hype for a while, got caught up, and then I was able to have the proper emotional investment for Infinity War and Endgame, and it was worth it. So, since we've got all of our history out of the way, let's go through the film starting with Phase 1, Movie 1, Iron Man 1. So, what are your feelings and memories on this movie like?
Kind of like yours, of watching it at a very young age. It didn't really click for me as it like. Well, I wasn't necessarily a part of the audience that was expected to understand the scope of the film and like the what exact and like it was for superhero films. It was entertaining enough for me as a kid to enjoy. Um, but obviously, like I watched the end credit scene then, I didn't really process it. I didn't really understand the entire scope of the whole thing. But as a film, I think it stands pretty well. I think it opens the character very well, and you know the whole the most confusing thing for me when it comes to this film had to be um, let's see, you still there?
Yes, yes. I was just being polite.
Sure. I think the only thing that like confused me as this film relates to other films was the actor change for Rhodey.
Oh yeah, well,
I which I appreciate now. I appreciate that
yeah,
that's what happened.
cause like the original actor of Rhodey wasn't bad, but like I just think Don Cheadle was better. And if I could derail for a bit, I it took me years to realize that the actors changed. I don't know what made me clicked, but I remember when I finally got around to rewatching Iron Man. I was like, that isn't Don Cheadle, and then we got Don Cheadle and everything.
Wait a
Yeah.
minute. For my take, I think the film is compelling enough on its own.
It kind of had to be in order to like a sell the people on the idea of this franchise and be successful enough to worth investing in the rest of the franchise.
Of course.
Yeah. My opinion, it is a really good film still to this day. And what one thing I find interesting going back not only through these movies but also like looking at the reception of not only just like of just like phase one in general, because like people were still surprised that these movies were like as good as they were, and the fact that they were potentially gonna form into something great. Because I remember as I was as I was watching these movies, I was going back through like old reviews, most specifically out of the reviews of Movie Bob, and it was so surreal because like I remember like um when I got to Iron Man 2 and like not only seeing the reception be generally more positive than it is now, but also like just people's just the Iron Man 1 is interesting because like it feels like the end of a specific era of superhero movies and the beginning of something
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the beginning of something new cuz like before before Marvel before the Marvel team got bought by Disney, and when they were with Paramount, the movies were shot on like reel to reel films, so that's why they look slightly different than everything that came after. Because after everything that was made from Disney and after were shot digitally. And it's also why certain movies have like certain aspect ratios to them as well.
Right.
And so, because one thing that's fascinating about phase about people's opinion of these movies during phase one and like early phase two stuff was the talking about how the first two acts were really good and then everything kind of fizzled out with act three, and of course something you don't really hear about much now is how kind of boring the villain is.
Hmm.
Because like for a while, the only villain during phase one and early phase two that people were like interested in was Loki. And that's probably
Right.
because he
Yeah.
was the villain of the first Avengers movie. But it's still kind of surreal because like from like late phase two and the rest of phase three, they got much better with their villains and pacing to the point where like that hearing people complain about how the third act and is kind of sloppy and how boring the villain is feels weirdly nostalgic to hear because it's been so long since I've heard anyone say that about any of the movies in like forever.
Yeah, I definitely feel like they got into the groove and found a good formula eventually.
Yeah,
But and still, like, it wasn't to the point of like, oh, these movies are unwatchable because of this sort of like lack of follow through with with their third acts and their villains. Um, but I don't know. I just felt very more like much more invested as that formula became more real
yeah.
and villains became better.
Yeah, so there one scene that sort of like had an impression on me was like near the end, and um, I got I for, Ironmonger, I guess his name was. I forget his name. So the villain of the movie, like he corners Tony in his lab, and he like
Wasn't his name like Obadiah?
Obadiah Stane, that's his name. Obadiah Stane. Yeah. Also, to derail again, in addition to the Iron Man films, I got my Iron Man kick not only from like seeing old reruns of the '90s cartoon, but from like this other cartoon that was like airing on Nicktoons Network of all things, where it was like
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, I have very fond memories of that, and like it only ran for like two seasons, and like there were alternate versions of like the villains that I thought were like kind of
Yeah.
more interesting takes than the villains we got from the first three Iron Man movies. And to get back to the scene that had a that kind of stuck with me throughout the years was the scene where Tony gets his life support ripped out and he's just struggling to get the spare one. That did that stuck with me not necessarily I did feel tense for it. I did there was tension to it, but it wasn't like a turn off. It didn't like scar me or whatever. But for whatever reason, I did have a dream where like it was essentially the exact same scene, only Tony dies, and then I just woke.
Jeez.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It wasn't even like nothing was different. It was like I was replaying the scene, but Tony dies, and then I just kind of woke up, not even frightened or whatever. I was just like,
How old was that? Like when you're from your initial watch of the film,
yeah,
like
that
when
was
you were
like a
8?
month after I saw it. So I just saw that Tony dies. I just woke up and I was like, that was weird, and then went back to bed. Uh, so Iron Iron Man 1, pretty good movie. It feels weird to call it a classic, but I guess we can call it. It's like
I suppose.
because it like ushered in everything. So the next film is The Incredible Hulk. So what kind of what kind of what's your opinion on The Incredible Hulk?
I haven't seen the movie.
Well,
Um,
it isn't it isn't bad because I still I saw this and because it was part of I can I'll tell you this, the movie isn't bad. It has some interesting ideas. It's not a horrible watch. The CGI does look a little dated to some degree, but isn't like the ugliest thing ever. And
mhm.
basically, every plot point introduced in every potential plot point and thread that you might think might get some acknowledgement in future films doesn't, because like there's like this little tease of like a potential Hulk related villain making a future appearance and he never comes. There's so many unfulfilled plot threads and I'm not mad at that because they just because they just kind of decide all of that isn't really worth pursuing. So yeah, and honestly, it's kind of hard to make a Hulk movie because most of the story potential comes from Bruce Banner himself and not so much from the Hulk. So that's why he kind of works best as like a side character, regardless if he's being Bruce or Hulk. So so I guess we're just sort of kind of like grazing over this because there isn't really much to talk about and there never really was much to talk about. So I guess we can just skip that and go straight.
I have one question.
What?
It's not Mark Ruffalo, right?
Yeah. The Mark. He's the one we have currently, right?
Yes.
So he is yeah, he wasn't in that. A funny thing, the dude who played the main character in Fight Club, not Brad Pitt obviously, but the dude who played the nameless protagonist from Fight Club actually played Bruce Banner in that, but they
Mm.
that's also one of the few that's sort of like the only remarkable thing was the other actor involved. So moving on to Iron Man 2. If I'll cut straight to the point. The only thing that keeps this movie from being watchable all these years later is the main cast, and that's sort of what people over time later came to accept. Because if it wasn't for this set of actors, I don't think it would even be worth watching, period.
Hmm.
I remember when I was younger, I had fun with this, and to be honest, the only worthwhile things is, of course, the main cast's performance, the presence of Whiplash, and when he gets to be Whiplash, but that's about it, and that fight at the end where Tony um, and Rudy get to fight all of those robots in their respective suits. and we see the debut of the Iron Patriot before. I'm not sure if this is contentious or not, but while the American flag theme he later gets makes sense because Iron Patriot all and he's like a member of the military, I do kind of like just the regular gray and slight blue tint his initial suit had, mostly because
Yeah, yeah.
that's just, I think that's just because that's the version I'm used to seeing, but his other design does make sense.
Mhm.
I remember when I was younger, I did kind. It was merely the fact that he had a shoulder mounted machine gun that kind of made me like the suit better. Because I think there was just like a scene where he was just shooting from, and I was like, that is amazing.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah. So and also there was also there were a handful of things from this. It was nice seeing this. It was nice seeing Tony struggle with the fact that he has like this huge responsibility as a not only a public figure but also as like a superhero essentially. And it was nice seeing like the seeds planted to much more interesting forms of that type of storyline that we would later see in other films. And smaller but more funnier things was you remember in the first Iron Man film how Stan Lee cameoed as Hugh Hefner.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
Well,
yeah.
they kind of continued that joke, but instead of him playing Hugh Hefner, he's Larry King. And then like
Okay, yeah.
during the party where like Tony is like completely drunk and making an ass of himself, and Rudy is just trying to straighten him out as that's happening. Robot Rock by Daft Punk is playing in the background, and that's superficial, admittedly, but it was just like a nice little thing because I just like that song.
Yeah, okay.
And I think that's all I really have to say about Iron Man 2. It's not I don't think it's like I wouldn't even go as far as to call it a bad film, but it's certainly like if we're talking movies, it's certainly like one of the weakest, maybe the worst if I had to pick a worst, but
Mm, I can't say I agree with you there
uh
because there is another Iron Man film we haven't spoken about yet.
oh really? Well that'll be interesting, but that's a bit of the of a ways off. So Iron Man 2 is done, and here comes.
I actually have a couple things to say about Iron Man 2 myself before we
Oh,
move on. That's
okay.
okay.
You can say your piece.
The, I agree with you that the cast is mostly the only saving grace for a good part of this film, and there isn't a lot of depth to it and to its relation to the overall universe, unless you're regarding like the whole Shield
Yeah,
induction
Shield is like
into
Shield is formally introduced in this, and there's one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about Iron Man 1. Also, in addition to that film just being as good as it was, one thing that people were really shocked by was that Tony reveals himself to be Iron Man, and Marvel just kind of like issues in this trend where people don't really, unless they're like smaller scale heroes where they're not really concerned about their superhero identity and their personal identity, and so that's something cool. So you were saying regarding your thoughts on Iron Man 2.
the I saw the Nicktoons cartoon that you're talking about, and it had another version of
Whiplash.
Ivan Bunko of Whiplash.
Yeah.
I think this is the version that I've that character to be played as the most, and that's when he was the character, the villain, Crimson Dynamo, as opposed to Whiplash.
Yeah.
Which is kind of his dynamic is cool to me. Crimson Dynamo's is, but I guess I understand why they would go with Whiplash because Crimson Dynamo is just kind of another guy in another big suit,
Yeah,
and it wouldn't be very different from Ironmonger. I understand, but
yeah,
to me, that was just a little bit boggling to like see the character be two different villains around the same time.
yeah. I
Uh,
remember.
Also, I wasn't that compelled by
Yeah, no one was
the
really
the
compelled.
character.
No one was really compelled by Whiplash and Iron Man 2, and the Iron Man Armored Adventures, as the show was called. One thing that kind of confused me was that like I had a hard time telling if this was a man in a suit or if it was just like an artificial intelligence because there was like four. It went through like four different models, if I remember. And I was every time a new model was introduced, I was just confused. Yeah. So, is that all you have to say regarding Iron Man 2?
I think that's all I've got.
Okay, so we are moving on to Thor 1. And so I of course didn't I saw advertisements for this, but I of course didn't get around to seeing this at the time. That's going to be the theme for a lot of movies going forward. So be prepared.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I saw a good chunk of them.
Yeah. So what did you think of Thor 1 when you first saw it, and what do you think of it now?
My initial impression of the film and kind of my current impression of the film, it was a little bit lighter to me.
Yeah.
It felt more it felt less burdenous on on me as a viewer, and it felt like, okay, hero, okay, he's not worthy, okay, he does things or something, and then okay, he's worthy
Are
in
you
the time of his death. It was a very predictable movie for me,
Yeah.
and I was okay with that because I rather enjoyed Hemsworth as the character very early on.
Yeah. I remember as I went researching into what people thought of this movie at the time. Of course, you got like those fools who were disappointed that it was a lot more easier to more accessible than like they were probably predicting for something like for Thor. And to some, it was kind of like a wake up call that they were kind of like taking family entertainment a little too seriously because they realized, wait, this is a movie about a space Viking. Why wouldn't kids like this? And why wouldn't they want to market that more so to kids? So that's another interesting thing because like a lot of people at the time, even before the Zack Snyder superhero movies made their way, people were sort of this movie kind of people were sort of wanting to have superhero movies take like a slightly darker edge, and some were more successful than others before these movies came out. But more often than not, the darkness was a bit superficial in some sense. And then when
Especially when the film has the word dark in it.
yeah, and then when Thor 1 came out and it was a relatively fun and sort of inoffensive movie in itself, it was sort of a wake up call to some people saying, maybe I should go into these sort of things with a bit more of a positive attitude, and some did indeed do that. Uh, I agree that Thor overall like I the movie is worth what it, I would like to watch that movie again sometime, and like the movie itself is still just rather fun. It just kind of it just kind of feels a little uneventful when we're like on Earth and nothing mystical is rather happening. Are you familiar with the character's original origin story in the comics?
No, not at all.
Well, basically, when the first version of Thor was coming out, it was presented in a way to make us feel like this random dude whose name I forget found the hammer and then he was
Whoa.
seen worthy as Thor, and he was able to transform into Thor. But then further down the road, he later realized that he was actually Thor himself, just banished and had his memory wiped away and all of his mortal and all of his god power stripped away until he was found worthy. So it was essentially similar to what Thor had to do in this movie, only except his memory wasn't wiped and he still had his godlyhood intact to some degree.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
I guess it introduced Hawkeye.
yeah, it did.
I
I remember, and I remember people, and this would, I think, this feeling would last all the way into the end. But people initially and for many years to come were kind of disappointed that he didn't get to wear his costume in the movies, or at least people had like
I,
people at the time were like hopeful were like cautiously optimistic that he would eventually get his costume, and then it never happened because they were like, okay, he's doing his responsibility as a shield agent. It would feel weird to suddenly have a dude in purple tights with an arrow. This makes sense. And then the Avengers came along and subsequent appearance, and he never had that suit, and people were still disappointed up until the very end. Who knows? Maybe he might have the suit in his own movie, but I'm not.
I don't miss the cowl, honestly.
I don't miss the suit at all, mainly because I never got attached to the suit. If he has the suit, he has the suit. If he doesn't have the
For
suit,
the character.
I won't lose sleep over it. And I think people just slowly over time stopped caring that he didn't have the suit. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, Thor one, a pretty fun movie, and now Captain America, the First Avenger. I actually did. I actually did see this. Not when it came out, but it was still like relatively when, because like I remember like a year after it came out, there was one time in class where we were watching it for some reason, and I wasn't really
Mm.
paying attention because I don't know. I don't know why. I just remember people going nuts about it. I remember when I remember in a moment that is truly a moment that I could have done when some girls were talking about how attractive Steve Rogers looked when he got his muscle bod. I was like, he had to do a crap ton of workout and dieting for that. Because that was the only thing I knew about the
Yeah, kind of
movie.
me.
Going in, I was like, wow, he had to do a lot of workouts. He had to eat a lot of healthy food, and every
That's,
time,
that's the only context you have.
yeah,
Just the real world actor having to do work to be this person.
yeah, yeah. So when people were gushing about how muscular he was, I was like, a lot of hard work went into that. He had to do a lot of dieting. It was tough, man.
I feel like a lot of people don't have that sort of appreciation for his work, just his body.
Yeah, I think they just kind of like stared at me blankly, and then went back to watching the movie after I said that. And then like somebody pointed out how there was like an old version of the flaming torch costume in that museum. So uh um this movie was in my archival internet digging, there were people concerned about how Captain America, my bad, would be presented in because people were afraid he would be like overly jingoistic, but no, that's not the case, and thankfully it wouldn't be the case going on later down the road, and it's one of the a lot of people say that this is that Chris Evans as Captain America was one of those types of casting where you can't picture anyone else in the role going forward.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of have to agree, even if I didn't really get attached to this. And it's also one of those few moments where the idea you get of the person playing this role isn't contradictory to how they are in real life. at least from what I've seen people say about him and how he's presented himself in public. So that's nice. To many people, I bet this was their first introduction to the Red Skull, but I was aware of the Red Skull for
Mhm.
a while, even when this movie came out, and since it was taking place in uh, World War II, I knew for a fact he was going to be the antagonist. Funny thing, my exposure to the Captain America origin story wasn't through this movie, but it was through these teaser shorts that were made to promote the Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes cartoon, and that came with shorts about the Hulk, Iron Man, the Black Panther, and Wasp and Hawkeye as well. And that also served as my. It was either that or the Iron Man cartoon that introduced me to the Black Panther before.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I knew about most of the mythology centering around the Black Panther before I saw a Black Panther as well. And I, in addition to people being pleasantly surprised as to how Captain America was portrayed in this movie and the many other movies going forward, people also seen that like it didn't do any sort of revolutionary movie making techniques or anything, but there were like small moments that got pleasant reactions out of people. One moment was when one of the Hydra agents pushed a kid in the water, and then when you think he's gonna spend time rescuing him, he says, "I can swim, go catch him." That apparently like got a reaction out of a lot of people. And I guess at the time I could see why, but it seemed very very fairly minor. At the end of the day, I think a common theme that's like uniting the Phase One movies, with the possible exception of the first Avengers movie, was that I guess so they could have an easier time hooking a more general audience on the idea of these movies. They wanted to have the most like polished version of this movie that they could, so that would be easier for everyone to grasp and potentially get hooked on. And that's how I generally feel about most of the movies during Phase One, is that they're like they're like action movies with like no fluff. They're like pure entertainment. It's like there to get you hooked on not only the character but also like the rest of this franchise. And yeah, the only like memorable moment in the long run is not only seeing the Red Skull remove his mask, but also just the entire scene leading up to Captain America freezing himself in the plane, and then him waking up what he thinks is the 40s, but him being able to tell that was a archived recording of a game he went to, and then him just like completely surprised of just how much New York has changed in the decades he's been absent from the world. And then it just ends with Nick Fury talking to him and saying, I guess like trying to get him on board with the Avengers initiative. So, what do you have to say about Captain America, the first Avenger?
I have very little to say about the film.
Uh,
Um, I believe it holds up.
yeah, I did.
I find that um, I enjoyed the portrayal of Steve Rogers and the Red Skull and Bucky, and it was a rather it felt like a superhero World War II film, I
Yeah,
guess.
that just reminds me another highlight of that movie is when they're like entertaining the troops. And they have that show where he's like essentially being marketed less as like a hero to help in the war and more just like a mascot for America. It had that funny scene where like he like punched Hitler in the face. So, yeah. And then like they had that scene where like comic books were being made about him, and they were like selling like comics about him, and like if you're wondering how that sort of because like that's sort of a gag they do in the comics as well, and if you're wondering how they can sell comics about comic book characters within the comic book universe, they're actually sold as like autobiographical tales within the comic book universe, and the artists and writers who read the books we're reading are the same ones who make the ones within the comic book universe. So
Mhm.
yeah. Any more thoughts regarding the Captain America movie?
Um, 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 Not particularly. I find it's pretty okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's really good. The um honestly, like the Captain America movies are probably like the most consistent in quality. Well, but if you asked me, I prefer like the Iron Man trilogy. But I don't know how much of that is due to my taste or due to the fact it was the only ones I kept up with before I knew about what the MCU was really. So, but yeah. Um, and I remember somebody saying it's kind of incredible that what they consider to be the worst Captain America movie is still, at the end of the day, a pretty good movie.
Yeah.
All right, and here is the first of many big ones, the first Avengers movie. The one of these that, like, before everything else came out, made, like, all the money in the world. So, where were you when this came out and when you saw it?
Probably where you are,
Yeah, I, I,
just living somewhere.
yeah, I saw it in the theaters because I was excited to see Iron Man again, and like there was also these other heroes that may or may not be interesting to me, and it I remember like me being like just my 12-year-old self watching this and just thinking to myself, yeah, this is a really fun movie, and then I hear all these people laughing really hard at certain jokes, and then like them having I don't remember if this actually happened or not, but when they had that big scene where all of the Avengers had officially assembled, I think the entire crowd was like cheering, which would be the first of many instances of big crowds cheering at Avengers
Uh,
movies. And when I saw this for the second time when I was going through my initial Marvel movie binge, uh, uh, it feels so weird talking about it, not only because of just how big of a movie it was at the time and its success, essentially cementing the fact that more of these movies are going to be made for who knows how long, and they're all going to do so much to like pop culture that I don't feel like I don't feel like I have enough I don't think I had enough personal investment to like passionately talk about it, and because it just the legacy of this movie feels too big for me to properly like discuss it, I guess.
mhm.
Yeah. So, what are your feelings regarding the movie?
I think my investment in the franchise came all too late. I think a big part of it came from this film, and I don't know. I I didn't find that an ensemble cast was foreign to me. Um,
I think that might be because
but
like for me, what the concept of a huge cast of superheroes was informed to me because I grew up with like the Justice League cartoon. I saw some Justice League
uh,
movies. I saw like I've been and seen plays with ensemble cast, especially at this time. At this time, I was also like in this like theater workshop group where we did like ensemble cast skits and occasionally like ensemble cast plays. So I was pretty I was pretty used to the idea. I think what I guess what I guess what I think what was hard for me is me trying to put put myself in the headspace of other people who thought that a crossover to this degree wasn't would never be possible, let alone by the same studio. And it not only worked, but it was like probably at that time one of the best superhero movies to come out in a long time. Because while the idea of like crossovers and hype was not a new concept to me, to many people who probably make up a big majority of the audience, it probably was. So the idea of seeing Iron Man and Thor fight each other, and then Captain America not only interrupting the fight, but also surviving a full frontal blast of Thor's hammer with his shield was
uh,
probably like blowing people's mind. And then not only seeing Captain America stand up to Loki was also like another mind blowing moment. The and then just like that whole final scene of them teaming up, defeating all the aliens, and then like them encountering Loki at the end was probably just like the most adrenaline people felt in like a long time or ever at that point. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, as a kid, I felt. Um, I mean, okay, so I think contextually, I probably had a similar reaction in a like shocked, like goosebumps type way to this film at the age that I watched it at,
yeah,
as me now being a fan of the franchise for a while, having watched the climax of Endgame. I feel like those two things. I mean, obviously, at a at my current age and at my investment, the reaction was larger, but I feel like in terms of proportion, it was proportionally the same.
yeah. I remember.
I felt good and felt invested, even if it was a little bit less, just because I was a little bit younger and didn't see the whole picture.
Yeah, I remember like when I saw Infinity War and Endgame, and I was cheering at all of the like fan servicey type stuff. In the back of my head, I thought to myself, "This is what it must have felt like to watch the first Avengers movie." Because while the first Avengers movie seems rather small scale compared to those others, but at the time there was nothing as big as this at the time. So and one moment two moments that I still see as pretty awesome, that most people still to this day view is, of course, the like now iconic rotating shot of all of the Avengers at that time getting ready to defeat the alien army, and also the classic scene where Loki is going on his rant, and then he just gets flung around like a rag doll by the Hulk. That that scene will forever. That's a classic scene amongst many classic scenes in what is most definitely now considered a classic movie. And also little other small sort of stuff was Captain America and Iron Man not only like teaming up on the battlefield and like using his shield as a reflective form to bounce off the laser, but also like
Mhm.
they're in, they probably had the best interactions throughout the franchise in general, mostly because like their outlooks on life were so different. Also, just seeing scenes of Tony and Bruce Banner being scientists was also really interesting as well. Also, I'm not sure if this is just like a Josh Whedon thing or if it's just like something I never really picked on throughout these movies, but there's quite a fair bit of like comedy that like lands really hard for me even now.
Yeah, I agree. I was very shocked just to how funny these characters could
Yeah,
be, intentionally or otherwise.
special. My favorite moments of comedy not only go to the Hulk scene, but also where like Tony is just like scouring the entire Shield staff at that point, and he just kind of, as he's going on this rant about the technological aspects of it, he just points out to a dude and says, "That guy's playing Galaga." Thought we would notice, and then you later see the dude playing Galaga again, and also when they're given the breakdown of Loki, and when Thor's giving the breakdown of Loki, and he's talking about all of these things, and they like mention that like he's his brother, and then Thor's just like he's adopted. uh, and of course the scene where Nick Fury's talking about how these creatures were comparable to the flying monkeys from Wizard of Oz. Thor's confused, and then Captain America goes, "I do. I understood that reference." It still surprised me how often that scene still gets quoted to this day.
Yeah, it's a strange meme that like still exists. I understood that reference.
Yeah, I was even like I saw that even before like I had properly before the movie had like properly formed as a memory, and like even though I couldn't remember what this was at the time, I felt the humor behind it. So I think it still surprises me just how versatile that one scene and audio clip is to this day. Uh uh yeah.
This film had so much force behind it
Yes.
that I don't think a lot of people were even aware of when it came out. That everyone watched it
Yeah, and like
uh, and enjoyed it, and no one really realized just how big this was
yeah,
for the studio and for like the culture of superhero films.
yeah, and uh, it it's still kind of I still I guess I still to this day can't really like grasp the hype behind it. It just feels it in a short amount of in a short amount of time compared to other movies of its nature, it feels like one of those movies that has always been here, if you know what I mean. Like it's like there was a noticeable moment before this movie came out and when this movie came out, and everything regarding like fandom just sort of like changed overnight.
Mhm.
And when I saw this movie, I didn't even know that there were post-credit scenes. So not only was I surprised to find out about the Thanos tease, but also them eating the um, at that shawarma meat shop.
May I say something about Thanos?
Yeah,
He looked very not the way he looks now
but yeah,
in
that's
that scene.
yeah,
His teeth made me uncomfortable in that scene.
uh,
He looked very animated series Thanos-y.
yeah. At that
Nothing was familiar to me,
yeah.
but he just did. They really didn't commit to that look for him for very long,
Yeah,
I
they didn't
think.
even like. Cause from that scene and also like the cameo he had in like the first Guardians movie, it seems that the design not only was gonna be a fully CGI with motion capture sort of model, but it was also gonna resemble more about what he looked like in the comics. But thankfully, they have the version that we associate now, and it worked. So
Mhm.
yeah,
I like. I feel like he was always changing. Like
yeah,
Guardians one, he looked a little bit more organic.
yeah,
And then like I don't remember which film it was that he had the when he picked up the Infinity Gauntlet and said, "I'll do it myself." I think it was Avengers two,
yeah,
Age of Ultron.
yeah,
Um, like even there, he doesn't look quite the same as he does now. And then finally, they just settled
yeah,
on
and even
Josh Brolin esque.
yeah, and even when even when those movies were like being advertised, there were still like little changes being made that I'm not sure if they were the result of just stuff not being finished just yet, or if they just didn't want to spoil certain aspects. Because I remember in the trailers, you not only saw the shots with the Infinity Gauntlets of only like two stones in him, but instead of the giant iron suit that Bruce would use in the fight, it's the Hulk in the Wakanda fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean the Infinity Stones; those are most. I think that was just done to avoid spoilers, but I guess they had different plans for the Hulk. But whatever.
I would argue that the stones were a little bit of a spoiler because we always knew
Yeah, because I
from Ragnarok that Loki had the Tesseract.
yeah, because this was my when the movie was being advertised. This was sort of my interpretation of how things were going to go down. So it was going to be that the movie would. I was right with him. Actually, no, my plan was that I did expect people to die along the way in that movie, but I thought it was going to be like this whole intergalactic race sort of thing to see who can get as many Infinity Stones before who else, and then it would end, and then like the final movie would be them trying to gain control of the final stone, Thanos getting the final stone for the final act, and then them defeating him and like restoring as much as possible. I'm still surprised that Infinity War was able to catch as many people off guard as it did. Like there are people who weren't even like passionately invested in the Marvel movies who were like, yeah, this movie was fantastic. Yeah, but I'll save my later spiel about the movie and what people thought of the movies when we get there. Well, that closes the book on Phase 1. The next time we meet, we'll open up with Phase 2.